Hi there, I'm Peter O'Brien, CEO of VO2 Master, here with Andrew Sellars, Chief Science Officer, and we're here to discuss all things VO2 Master and human performance related. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Polar's brand new generation running watches, the Polar Pacer and the Polar Pacer Pro. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. Of course, we do this across a range of our different episodes, learn-ins catch-up episodes, interest editions, coaches' corners, featured performers, and our expert editions. Now, hot off the back of last week's expert edition with Dr. Stephen Seiler, who shared some overflow Q&A from the 2022 live stream event that he recently conducted, durability and high-intensity repeatability in endurance sports, today you are in for a fascinating look into some of the hottest new technology in the endurance market. That is the VO2 Master Analyzer. It's the world's first wearable, easy-to-use metabolic analyzer. It's portable, reliable, and affordable, as the founders say, and we get to hear from the founders today on this expert edition. That is Dr. Andrew Sellars, medical doctor and self-acclaimed passionate physiologist, and co-founder and advisor, computer scientist Peter O'Brien. Now, many will have seen this device on the faces of current World 70.3 Triathlon champion Gustav Iden and his Norwegian counterpart, Kristian Blummenfelt, current Olympic, World Triathlon Series and World Ironman champion, who is regularly seen with the VO2 Master Analyzer on his face during both indoor and outdoor training sessions. Furthermore, back on episode 302, which is actually the most downloaded episode in the Physical Performance Show's history, which featured Olav Alexander Boo, Triathlon Norway's sports scientist and elite coach, who throughout that episode mentioned the cutting-edge technologies that Team Norway have been deploying to dominate the world of triathlon. Now, you'll hear Peter O'Brien and Dr. Andrew Sellars reference their relationship with the Norwegian team's success, share around the long development of this technology, and importantly, the reason why they felt it was so necessary to develop the world's first wearable and portable metabolic analyzer. Andrew and Peter outline why it is important for athletes to be able to measure their VO2 Max and their VO2, along with respiratory dynamics, in order to make wise training decisions. So here is my conversation on this episode. We're titling Endurance Technology Innovators with Peter O'Brien, CEO, and Dr. Andrew Sellars, co-founders of VO2 Master. Peter O'Brien and Dr. Andrew Sellars from VO2 Master, welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thanks for having us.
This is a real treat. Those in the endurance sporting world will mostly and likely have been seeing the device that your team have engineered and pioneered, and that is the world's first portable VO2 sensor unit. And the current World Ironman champion, Kristian Blummenfelt, and Olympic champion and World Triathlon Series champion reigning, has probably really put a lot of spotlight on this device. It's the blue mask that you see him out training with at times and in the lab with at times. So, gentlemen, how did this all get started in your respective roles?
Well, I think it all started when I met Andrew after I dropped out of swimming. I was an avid swimmer as a teenager. I think I was about 15. And Andrew had a great way of objectively assessing athletes in order to tweak their training regime and then retest them to see if, what he had objectively tried to change was actually changed. So I got to kind of, leave swimming and learn cycling and triathlon and a whole bunch of physiology from him, actually, which was super cool. And then, sort of later in my teen years, I think I really liked all things nerdy. So I started to learn about coding, and I think Andrew needed a hand with some data interpretation. Because he would do repeated testing, say every 6 weeks, with a VO2 machine, heart rate, physio flow, and just about every sensor he could get his hands on. And so you get all these different data tables, and you don't know what to do with them. So they started writing a software tool to put them all together. All Andrew's idea, really. And then at some point, we had the crazy idea of delving into hardware. And that was a 9-year journey from then to now of replacing the conventional metabolic analyzers out there with something that's simple, portable, and affordable.
Simple, portable, and affordable. But this is not overnight. This is a 9-year engineering, evolving the concept, test, retest, to get it to what's really quite an attractive looking, metabolic analyzer compared to what you typically see in universities.
Peter typically undersells the incredible amount of work that he put into shifting his brain from the athlete side into the science side. And he really did take it on when he realized that his career in cycling was better spent as a career in computer science and engineering. And so
cardiac output too low, definitely.
Yeah.
Andrew, you label yourself a passionate physiologist. You're also a medically trained doctor, anaesthetist, on call at the moment, actually, as we record this. So you've got that deep medical training, physiology background, but also you've got a real passion for endurance sports and high performance.
Yeah, well, Peter and I overlapped a little bit because I actually grew up as a swim coach. I was a swimmer, but not a great swimmer. And I realized very early that I was never going to be competitive at an international level. So I actually started coaching at a young age, swimming primarily. And then before I went to med school, I did a master's in education in coaching studies and worked at the University of Victoria with the swim team there. As part of my rotation through swim coaching, I spent some time in a small northern town in BC called Quesnel, where there was a very passionate physiologist, Swiss-trained, who was truly brilliant and an incredible mentor to me, and that was Jörg Feldman. He changed my life and my understanding of physiology and challenged a lot of the things that I had been taught at university, and so really was a pioneer and a forefather of a modern way of looking at lactate measurements. And he developed the lactate balance point test along with a colleague of his, and we became advocates and strong users of lactate at the time. This is back late 90s, early 2000s, and helped him develop some educational courses around sharing how to use lactate. And so when I met Peter, we were doing lactate balance point tests, but we had incorporated VO2 monitoring with a desktop VO2 monitor. As Peter alluded to, we started using PhysioFlow, which is a non-invasive cardiac monitor, which gives real-time measurements of cardiac output. And we were looking for ways to be able to combine all of the data that was coming in. So everything from power, heart rate, lactate, VO2, respiratory dynamics, and cardiac dynamics, all into a single visual cue sheet that we could see the changes that were happening in real time. We were also playing around with the original near-infrared spectrometry, the precursor to the Moxie device, which was done by Portamon at the time, which was a medical-grade NIRS technology. And all of that data started to uncover some of the true physiology that was happening in real time, that up until then we'd been using surrogate markers like lactate to see what was happening at the muscular level. And once we could see what was happening at the cardiac and respiratory level in real time, it just became a way of being able to see the data and analyze the data, ideally in real time, but also make the post-production look at the data much easier. And Peter was involved with the foundational work of collecting all that data. When we realized it didn't matter how much work we did on that, it was never going to make money for us. It was never going to be a sustainable product that we could sell to thousands of people because of the complicated use of that equipment. At the time, the equipment combined value of that equipment was probably close to 80,000 Canadian dollars, up to $100,000 when you include the PhysioFlow, which was $20,000 device, and NIRS, which at the time was a $10,000 device, and the desktop VO2 was 10 to 15. And so Peter said, well, what are we going to do with this? And I said, well, until we can make affordable testing equipment, we're never going to be able to share this with the world. And Peter took a look at our desktop VO2 and said, you know, it's not that complicated device. I think we could make this device portable by just using all the same pieces, but then adding a Bluetooth technology and sending it. And this is right at the sort of beginnings of Bluetooth technology and ANT plus technology. And so he really took what has been commonly used as VO2 monitoring equipment in the past. And really, there's not a lot of difference between all of the high-end units, how they measure volumes and flows and things. There's only a couple different prime methods. And what Peter was able to do was pull all of those kind of units down into a smaller unit that doesn't have any moving parts. And that's the patented technology that we have, is how to move air through a unit that doesn't actually need a fan, doesn't need to have a suction device to sample units through the oxygen cell. But the actual method of collecting gas samples and analyzing them isn't new. The only part that's new is how we do it without moving parts and then sending that information Bluetooth to an app. And so that became the huge jump to now having such a portable unit that people can wear it anywhere. So now you can start testing people when they're climbing a rock wall, or you can do it while they're rowing in a boat, or you can do it in any number of CrossFit athletes, right? And you could never test those athletes in the real world situation before. But now that the unit's so portable and the data comes across so quickly to your phone, you can actually see in real time how they're breathing, what kind of oxygen consumption they're using, where their struggles are, when they hit a point at which they can't sustain what they're doing from a respiratory point of view. I'm sort of rambling a little bit, but that's kind of why we went to where we were going, is because we were limited in the testing that we were doing by the equipment that we had. And everybody in the last 10 years has been pushing that envelope. So our NIRS technology is more affordable now. There's a couple of different companies that are making affordable units that are meant for the athletes. They're super simple. They're easy to transfer data from. So our device picks up their signals to go along with our device as well. So now you can look at what's happening locally at the muscular level for how oxygen is being used locally. And then you can look at how it's used globally using our unit to look at the actual oxygen consumption. Yeah, so those two pieces of equipment together give in real time what lactate does as a surrogate marker for exercise intensity.
Yeah. It used to be a package where, you had a tabletop unit, a whole bunch of other sensors. I remember you spent hours sometimes putting data tables together just to make a report, which was, crazy, but that was the technology available. And I think the fundamental reason in a way was that the metabolic analyzer you were using, the reason I think that sort of, put me over the edge was that the analyzer you're using had a thermal printer on it. So, people were doing VO2 testing they offer $100 test to a client, and they finish the test and they print the report and they tear it off like a cashier's receipt. Here you go. It was ridiculous. And it's essentially today it is the smaller package that I think Andrew envisioned too of a kit that's just a bunch of Bluetooth sensors that go into one modular phone app that puts all the data together for the assessor, because none of that should be work a person does.
Actually, if you hold the unit up again there, Peter, it comes with a calibration cylinder as well. In a quite a neat and tidy box. Lionel Sanders unpacked it on one of his little YouTube videos there. And for those, not everyone will have experienced in laboratory testing. I've come through an exercise science physio background, so I had my fair share of testing done at university and conducting them. And, the equipment was expensive, as you pointed out, Andrew, $100,000 plus metabolic carts, bulky. You couldn't take it outside. You couldn't take it into the field. So your technology is cutting edge in shifting that from just in laboratory assessment to the field. If we talk about the benefits to the endurance sporting community, Andrew and Peter, in simple terms, what are the benefits? What are the great outcomes they can get through adopting technology such as this? In other words, why should the endurance sporting community care, apart from the fact that we all look at the likes of Kristian Blummenfelt and Lionel Sanders and aspire to be like them and do the things that they do?
I think it comes down, there's a great quote when Peter and I were first putting together our website and trying to share with people what we were doing, was the idea that you can't improve what you can't measure. If everything we're doing is in endurance sport is trying to improve performance, then everybody has different ways of measuring that performance. And really the only true measurement is a race. Right? That's the only thing that really should matter, is how they perform when it comes to race day. And like you said, Kristian and Lionel had pretty amazing races a couple of weeks ago. And the question is, how did they improve? They're both really happy with their performance, but they know that if they stay where they are now, other people are going to come and catch them. So really it is measuring where they are now to see what areas they can improve to become faster in the future. And oxygen consumption has always been one of the prime limiters, or some people call it the ceiling, some people call it the predictive size of the engine. But if you don't measure it, you actually don't know whether you're improving it or not. So the whole concept for me, and has always been, and this is back to the challenges that Jörg put to me when he was mentoring me, is if you say you're going to change something for the better, you better have measured it first and then be able to prove it by measuring it later. Otherwise, all you're doing is measuring the performance and saying, well, the person got better and that got faster, and that's great if you know how they got there. And this was always the problem, is someone would get better and they would assume that the improvement in performance was due to something, but they never knew what it was that was improved. Was it because they breathed better? Was it because they had a bigger heart? Was it because they moved their feet faster? Was it because they were psychologically tougher and they were willing to put up with more hurt? Like guys like Lionel Sanders, who are willing to dig so deep that at that point it's purely psychological. If you can take someone who's a good athlete and allow them to hurt as much as Lionel Sanders does, is that all you need to do? Maybe physiologically he's already as good as he can get. So for me, the reason we created a device that is for everybody is so that they can measure one piece of the puzzle. And VO2 is one piece of the puzzle. There's lots of pieces to that puzzle that coaches are working on all the time. That's why we use VO2, is to measure one piece of the puzzle and make sure that if we say we're going to improve their VO2 max, that we actually measure it before, measure it after, and show an improvement. If we're trying to measure performance at sub VO2 max, which is where all of these guys work, nothing of Ironman or any endurance event is ever at VO2 max. It really is how close to VO2 max can they go and stay in control. And if you haven't measured that before and after, you don't know whether your training is actually working or not.
So the importance of measurement and not just assuming or flying blind, really, and just looking, as you say, at the outcome or the performance improved. But so what changed here? What changes might athletes, coaches expect, Andrew and Peter, in terms of if they start to integrate testing and using a device such as VO2 Master? There's a large genetic component, obviously, to someone's aerobic engine or VO2 Max. Where's the line for the genetic component versus the trainable component? Obviously, it's different for everyone.
I'm a huge believer in training, the fact that you can actually train VO2 Max dramatically. And the common sense would say someone didn't get a high VO2 Max without training to get there. You're right. Some of the genetic component is more how readily the body responds to that training. But you'll never get a high VO2 Max from somebody who's sedentary, and you'll never get a low VO2 Max from somebody who's been training really well. So the question is, how high can it go? And then the next question is, does it really matter how high it goes? And there's pretty good evidence that maybe it doesn't matter all that much. We have some really good evidence of some guys with the highest VO2 maxes measured who don't perform as well as some of our athletes that have low recorded numbers. Yet the lower recorded numbers are just more efficient. So that is one of the prime factors that we look at. Using VO2 is the efficiency. So that's one of the first changes that you'll see and that you can see if you look closely at the data. So how efficient, how much oxygen consumption does it require to run 10K an hour, to run 15K an hour, to run 20K an hour? And what kind of changes can we make to make the running stride more efficient? Same on a bike. What can we do to allow the speeds to happen at lower and lower VO2s, not higher VO2s. We don't want someone working at a high VO2. We want them working at the lowest VO2 they can to give them the speed that they need to go. So this whole sub 7 project that Kristian's working on is going to be fascinating, because the whole goal will be to do as little work as he can on the bike to make the time splits that he needs to go to be able to run fast enough off the bike, right? We don't want him using any energy on the bike. So we would hope that he's using our unit to help him guide his training to be as efficient as he can on the bike, to use as little oxygen consumption as possible. And while he's doing that, also to be looking at how he's breathing on the bike. So in his new aero position, on his new bike, how is his breathing working? And so our unit can be used for that as well, to look at his respiratory dynamics. So the two big pieces from a VO2 Master are respiratory dynamics, and then the oxygen consumption, aiming for the best efficiencies in whatever sport you're doing, whether it's CrossFit, triathlon, cycling, running, whatever sport you're doing, the idea is to be as efficient as possible. That means the lowest oxygen consumption for the level of work that you're doing.
Which is an intuitive concept, and I think every endurance athlete gets that, but it's the ability to see in real time if the training and the subsequent adaptation is actually making a difference. So I know on Lionel's YouTube video there, he was on the trainer on the bike and he was commenting, and he was at that point not fully prepped and partially deconditioned, and he was commenting on his inefficiency at that point. Obviously, he dialed that in before St. George just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and fascinating because I use my unit all the time, and I'm always challenged. Peter's always challenging me to push it to its limits. So I'll wear my unit for long trainer sessions, and so I have the fascinating insight of what happens when you play around with things. So you don't just do a standard step test, you actually use it in training and see what happens to your efficiency over time. So when you're an hour into a workout, when you're 2 hours into a workout, when you're 3 hours into the workout, how does your oxygen consumption change? What happens when the body heats up? What happens if you try higher cadence? Does it improve your efficiency? Does it drop your efficiency? The whole concept of is it better to push slower cadence on a bike and save your fast leg speed for the run, or does it kill your quadriceps and burn you out? Well, fascinating things happen to different people at different cadences. Their breathing dynamics change and their oxygen consumptions change. And if they can't efficiently breathe under control with higher cadence, then guess what? It's not actually their legs that are giving out with higher cadence, it's actually their breathing that's giving out. There is so much data that you can pull if you're willing to actually look at changes over time and changes between sessions and changes between athletes. So not all that, and this is why you see at the Tour de France, some guys like Froome climbing the steepest pitches at still the ridiculously high cadence, and he can tolerate that because he's really efficient at a high cadence turnover. But he's the only guy in the world that can do it at that cadence, at that intensity, right? Everybody else slows their cadence down and stands up and starts, and he just keeps sitting and pushes really high cadence. But he's figured out that that's an efficient way to go. And I bet if you do his VO2, it'll be dramatically different between the two different riders.
So I was looking at changes over time between sessions, between athletes, like you just mentioned there, Andrew. And Peter, you're going to add something there?
Let's just add on that idea of individualization. So I think conventional VO2 testing and conventional athlete assessment is done once or twice a year, which is fine. I mean, to get a snapshot of where someone is at, but it's insufficient to fully describe their physiology over time. And that's what I admired about what Andrew started in his team, Balance Point Racing, is really to just take an individual snapshot, just call it a snapshot that will change, try to change it and remeasure it. So say like working with Olav in Sierra Nevada earlier this year, Olav takes it to a new level and measures his athletes every single session to the point where he almost needs a glorified technician, a glorified water boy to come up and help him put all this data together, And of course, even at the highest level, all athletes are completely different. Like you can even see that on the run course at Ironman, where Lionel looks completely different from Curry or from Blummenfelt. And even when Kristian and Gustav are running side by side, you can see they're quite different as well. Yet they're that close together in terms of actual speed on the course, and they're the two best triathletes in the world right now, for the most part.
And were you the glorified water boy / technician? Is that right, Peter? Up at Sierra Nevada with the Norwegians, yeah? Yeah,
we have an understanding. Yeah, that's terrific. I mean, it's really interesting working with them. I mean, I think we get to help them out, and in return we get to play around with new beta technology, and get to learn a bit ourselves. So it's really fun working with those guys.
And you mentioned Olav, Peter, and for those that aren't familiar with that episode, Olav Alexander Boo, Kristian, Gustav's coach and exercise scientist, physiologist. His episode of the Physical Performance Show has actually now been the most downloaded in the history of the show across the 5 or 6 years. So there's a high interest in the innovation that the Norwegian team are adopting and implementing, not just for the sake of it. It's clear in the performance that there's a lot of gains to be had here, and VO2 Master is front and center in some of that process. You mentioned, Andrew, the respiratory dynamics. Just in simple terms, what are some of the data that people can get from their respiratory dynamics in using the VO2 Master?
Yeah, so the two main ones are tidal volumes and respiratory frequency. And so that's how big a breath you take each breath, and the respiratory frequency is how fast you breathe. And those two combine to cause what we call ventilation, which is the amount of total liters of air that's moved every minute. And then from that data, we pull how much oxygen is consumed by comparing the inhaled gases versus what's exhaled. And at sea level and room temperature, you breathe approximately 21% of the air that you breathe in is oxygen. And you breathe out somewhat less than that, depending on how hard you're working and how fast you're breathing, and a sort of a fairly complex mix of combination of intensity versus ventilation. And then that difference in what you breathe in versus what you breathe out becomes the oxygen that's consumed. It's a fairly simple measurement. It's really complicated how it gets there, and it's complicated what happens in the body to produce that difference in oxygen. But the actual mechanism of measuring VO2 is simply that. It's measuring the amount of air that's moved and the difference between the oxygen that's coming in and the oxygen that's going out, and then quantifying that. So those are the four big numbers: respiratory frequency, tidal volume, ventilation, and then oxygen consumption per minute.
No need for CO2 analysis like there would be in a metabolic lab in a university laboratory setting.
Yeah, so there are some benefits to measuring CO2, and that's actually next on our production list. Peter and the engineers at VO2 Master have been working on it for a while now. It's coming, and there was actually a prototype in Sierra Nevada with Kristian. That was one of the reasons Peter went there, was to continue the work on that device in real world setting, and put it through its paces with some of the best athletes in the world to see how it measured up. So we have a prototype. It's coming. One of the challenges with CO2 is a mistaken belief that it's the understanding of CO2 production is mired in really not very good science. We know that CO2 is produced primarily by working muscles, and we know that the harder someone works, the more CO2 they're going to produce. This is what makes you breathe faster, right? The reason you take deeper, faster breaths the harder you work is because of the CO2 that you produce. It's not because you need more oxygen, it's because you have to blow off the CO2, because the CO2 is closely associated with the acidity in the body. And your body can't tolerate changing its pH very much outside of the normal range. So you blow off more CO2, and the challenge is that historically people have used two very simple mathematical equations to estimate the amount of CO2 that's going to be produced and whether that comes from sugars or from fats. It's not great science, but the information of CO2 is going to be much more usable once we've made it available to everybody. And that's why I'm keen for us to start incorporating CO2 into our device, is because the hidden benefits of CO2 haven't been studied very well because of how expensive the equipment's been and because it's been limited to the lab. So once we make it available to the masses, there will be a great wave of research available that wasn't available before. And we talk about the changes in breathing patterns and things like that, and how beneficial different breathing patterns can be for different athletes. That is all going to be much more easy to study once we have real-time CO2 and people actually looking at the actual CO2 consumption and not just using it to try and predict whether people are burning sugars or fats.
Not surprising, given that this is just an ongoing evolution of science, technology, and I guess in many ways democratizing the access to this data, which, as you say, you've created a portable and affordable device. In terms of resting metabolic rate, can we speak to how the VO2 Master helps determine this and why it matters? Why should an endurance athlete or anyone out there care about their resting metabolic rate? the knowledge of it.
Simply put, diet management. I mean, RMR is something I think that should be measured quite frequently, because one's resting metabolism will change regularly, especially with training and stressors and different environment, even temperature. So it's something that one can measure regularly in the morning that can help determine exactly how many calories someone should eat to either maintain, lose, or gain weight, of course. And it's active calories like a smartwatch will give you, plus your RMR. RMR can be calculated with either CO2 included or not. And my personal opinion is that it's not terribly more accurate to include CO2 in that metric. But yeah, beyond that, my understanding of the mechanics of the measure, I usually leave it to the experts like Andrew to decide exactly what to do with it.
The passionate physiologist, Andrew, over to you. Thanks, Peter.
The prime reason for me to using resting metabolic rate is to really to break down some myths. There are lots of people who we've tested resting metabolic rates who are drastically underestimating, and some that are overestimating what their basic needs are. So we had a young athlete years ago now who was a fantastic young triathlete who was training extremely hard and was struggling to actually sort of make the next level. And so we just measured his resting metabolic rate and helped him understand the amount of food that he was going to require to be able to not only train the way he wanted to train, but he was still, at the time, sort of just going through a pubertal growth stage. So we had to add 500 calories to his diet daily just to allow him to start his normal growth patterns. And within 6 months of that first metabolic test, he had grown 6 inches, put on 15 pounds, and was cycling almost 100 watts higher at his balance point than he had done 6 months earlier. And it was only because we recognized that he wasn't taking in the calories that he needed to maintain growth and development. So he was drastically underestimating what he needed in a given day. Likewise, we have other athletes who are high performance endurance athletes who were struggling to lose weight. And the question was really, did they need to lose weight, or were they trying to meet some sort of normative standard? We showed them that they were so fit that when they weren't exercising, they were burning almost no calories. They were burning half the amount of calories that an average person would burn. And it's just because they've trained themselves in a position where at rest, they're physically so well trained that at rest, they don't do anything. They don't burn any calories. And so if they ever wanted to lose weight, they were going to have drastic calorie reduction to be able to show weight loss. That conversation shifted to, do you really need to lose weight? You're performing at this very high level. What is weight loss going to give you? And Kristian and Olaf talked to that on the podcast. I listened to Olaf's podcast, which was fascinating. I agree. That whole idea that the more weight he loses, he's going to eventually start giving up power at a lower weight. And then it becomes a balance of how much power is he willing to give up to be that much lighter. And he showed that he actually didn't need to be lighter than he was. He carries a little extra weight and performs very well. Thank you very much. I'm now world champion at Ironman. Anybody who says he needs to lose some weight hasn't seen his results this year. So for him, it becomes a resting metabolic rate of how many calories does he need to maintain what he's doing and not lose weight and start potentially jeopardizing performance. Resting metabolic rate changes over time. It changes with training. It changes with parasympathetic and sympathetic drives. It changes with muscle mass. So if you start a training program and build muscle mass as part of that training program, your metabolic rate's going to change. And we know that. It's one of the benefits of doing strength training in the off season is it can actually drive your metabolic rate and help lose weight for those people that are actually legitimately trying to lose weight. So there's that group of people. There's the people on the other end that struggle to maintain performance and probably aren't taking enough calories, and resting metabolic rate helps them recognize that, you know what, you need these many calories just to survive. Now, on top of that, you're going to train and we're going to do a bunch of other things, and we should be measuring and see where things are going. Yeah. So again, it's a test, retest, and look at what the changes are that you expect to make and see if the changes are happening or what you expect.
You're listening to Peter O'Brien and Dr Andrew Sellars, co-founders of VO2 Master, on this Endurance Innovators episode. Today's episode is lovingly brought to you by Polar, the world's top choice in personal guidance for fitness, sports, and health. And Polar have recently announced 2 stunning new generation running watches, the Polar Pacer and the Polar Pacer Pro. These new running watches will give both first-time runners and serious runners the tools and the insights to track their performance and inform training. Engineered specifically for running, the Polar Pacer and the Polar Pacer Pro are equipped with a variety of functions unique to Polar and provide personalised guidance and support across the entire runner's journey, from the first steps for the beginner through to the marathon and beyond. The Polar Pacer Pro is for those who want to run better. It's one of the most powerful and sophisticated running watches ever built. It's ultra-light with a high-performance core processor and includes an extensive suite of advanced training tools that will help serious runners improve their running economy and performance. With built-in navigation and running power, it's debuting at an incredible $499. Meanwhile, the Polar Pacer, well, that's for those who want to fall in love with running. It's an ideal running watch for those who are starting their journey as runners. It embodies the simplicity of running with all the essentials, plus the specialised training, sleep and recovery tools they need to fall in love with the sport of running. The Polar Pacer will help all runners get started at just $299. So if you feel like it's time to beat your best, jump across to shop Polar over at polar.com. And support for today's show comes from the team at Endure IQ, the world-class triathlon training program founded by our much-loved and repeat guest, Dr. Dan Plews, acclaimed sports scientist, coach, and age group world championship record holder. Seize the unique opportunity and benefit from proven training plans for every level. Learn the key aspects of endurance performance from a scientific perspective and train with a community of experts and coaches. The highlight is that you'll get to know Dr. Dan personally during your weekly coaching and Q&A sessions via Zoom. Click the link in the show notes and use the code SQUAD2, that's capital SQUAD2, the numeric, to enjoy 2 weeks for free, which you can cancel at any time. Join the Endure IQ training squad now and make every session count, and look forward to your best season yet. For now, let's jump back with this week's Endurance Innovators episode featuring Dr. Andrew Sellars and Peter O'Brien, looking at the VO2 Master Analyzer device. So Andrew, the resting metabolic rate data is so paramount. As a sports physiotherapist, day in, day out, working with injuries such as bone stress injuries, which we know can have such a key contribution from an low energy availability state, which we look at the fuel required for resting metabolism, let alone the energy expenditure. It's mind-boggling how much the caloric intake needs to increase with these high energy expenders. And like you mentioned before, and like fellow guests of the show have mentioned over time, we can only manage what we can measure. So this is a way of actually not just guessing if we're actually fueling enough, but knowing. And you referenced Olav's expert edition, and we'll link that up in the show notes. But the thing that I took away from Olav's sharings is they are trying to maximize that caloric intake, because calories equals training work. They can get more done. It's just, It makes sense. So fantastic. And Peter, anything that you would like to add on the resting metabolic rate piece or conversation here?
Just one note about CO2 versus O2. I know a lot of people mention that they're of the opinion you need CO2 to take an accurate RMR measurement, but just food for thought, the Wear equation, 3.9 times VO2 plus 1.1 times CO2, it makes the weight of CO2 quite unimportant. You know, it's 3 times less important than VO2. So if you know RQ can shift from 1 to 0.7, extreme cases, you assume 0.85, that 15% change is actually 5 times less. So it's at 3% change at most. And you have to weight that value add of having CO2 with the accuracy of a CO2 sensor. For example, you can't calibrate a CO2 sensor accurately to ambient air generally. You have to have a reference calibration tank. So if you can get in a nice lab setting, really control a test, and do a beautiful reference tank CO2 sensor calibration, you might get a marginal increase in resting metabolism measurement, but you have to weigh that against having a tubeless, hoseless, and tankless system that can go anywhere. So it's there's always a balance to that one, but that's a misconception I hear all the time that I think should be corrected.
Okay, thank you for sharing. And I believe the inclusion of the CO2 measurement with the VO2 Master device, if people have a unit existing or looking to purchase a unit, that's just an automatic inclusion with a small an upgrade fee, I should say. Is that correct?
Yeah. So anyone who has a VO2 analyzer now, we guarantee they'll get the CO2 version for $1,500 US. And the way VO2 Master right now is $5,400 US. It might go up because of inflation, and $1,500 upgrade, so $7,900 or $6,900. And that is certainly going to be less than the price of a CO2 unit. So that's our way of saying thank you to everyone who's supported us along the way, getting them all up into the next version, and encouraging people to continue to support us as well.
Fantastic. And it's still a significant sum, but if we compare it to other portable units, the NOI device, I think $15,000 circa. The metabolic carts, you're talking $50,000 plus often. This is, as you say, as affordable and portable as it can get.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I quite like the price point because it still allows people to cash flow testing. So there's a lot of small businesses out there and coaches who need to be able to actually buy their equipment and still make a living. And one way to do that is to charge money for the assessments one provides. And that's simply impossible with a $50,000 lab cart. One just won't make money. That's why they're often reserved for universities. So I think that's part of democratization too, of trying to bring the price point down so more regular people can have access. It's still, fairly costly for an individual, but at least it's something that even small coaching businesses or gyms can afford.
And once again, you can manage what you can measure. The data is key. Gentlemen, if we could issue one piece of advice to maybe each of the groups that the listenership comprises, being coaches, athletes, and practitioners, and feel free, Andrew or Peter, to jump in here, but what would be the single piece of advice on this conversation of measuring respiratory dynamics, oxygen consumption, that you both feel that each of those groups should get? Maybe we start with the athletes themselves. If you could issue one piece of advice, what would it be?
Maybe that's, I guess I could draw from my personal history. I was 15 years old, avid swimmer. I blew up my shoulder rotator cuff impingement and bicep tendonitis from blatant overtraining from a local club that had produced many Olympians. And I didn't really understand why I was training so hard, why I was training like everyone else. I think it's crucial for athletes to try to learn about their own physiology, and through that, you start to understand why you train the way you do. And become a smarter athlete. I think that was huge for me. I mean, it was awful as a 15-year-old to drop out of my passion. It was the sport I did day in, day out, morning and evening. And then when I got to work with Andrew, I began to understand why I may have had those injuries and how I could actually objectively become better.
So learning about your own physiology, and obviously data like the VO2 Master provides can be a big part of that.
And that's, I like what Andrew's mentor, Jörg Feldman, used to say. I think, Andrew, you told me this, why do people run 10 kilometers? Because they have 10 fingers. It's completely arbitrary, and it really ought to be based on a measurement. Maybe 7.3 kilometers is the right amount. Who knows?
Yeah, that's powerful. Andrew, what would you say to coaches out there in the field? And this can be age group, recreational coaching through to, like you are both involved in, the highest level of performance, world record-setting performance, such as Kristian Blummenfelt.
Yeah, I would pick up on where Peter left off with the athletes is if we're going to expect the athletes to train the best way they can as an individual, then I would expect the coaches to provide that for athletes as well. And I would challenge coaches to provide the best level of training for each of the athletes that are under their umbrella. So I would ask them to move away from coaching them as a group and make sure that they understand that every person is going to get something different out of every training session. And I know that VO2 monitoring would help identify some of those things about what some athletes need to work on versus what others. So there's some internal reason for saying that. But that's the challenge that I would put to coaches, is recognize that everybody responds differently to training and everybody responds different to recovery, and allowing for those individual differences is going to make you a more successful coach with more athletes. And so it provides then a better chance of actually being successful with every one of your athletes and not losing people from, like Peter, who was a fantastic swimmer at 13 and 14 and dropped out of the sport at 15 because he was trying to do what the other kids were doing, and he needed something different at that time. And had he had a coach that recognized Peter's differences and built on his strengths and didn't hurt him, he'd probably still be swimming and enjoying the sport that he loved now. And he may not have ever made it into the international lanes, but he certainly would have been more successful than dropping out.
That idea of individualization certainly persists through the upper ranks too. Even Gustav and Kristian, I got to see them both train. They followed very similar regimes, but through consistent testing, even in individual workouts, they would decide whether they're going to cut it short or go longer and all that based on real-time measurements. And really, the two of them are substantially different physiologically, even though the result is that close to being the same. It's really even running form, the way they respond to individual workouts, how they recover, how they, I can't get too specific, but yeah, it's substantial how different they are. And then you look at Lionel, and Lionel looks completely different, especially on a running course compared to, say, Kristian or Gustav.
Yeah, this theme of individualization versus one size fits all. I mean, intuitively, it makes sense. And then practitioners in the field, whether this is exercise scientists, coaches, therapists, what would be a piece of advice there, gentlemen?
My big ask would be is to start looking at the data more holistically. So instead of just looking at a single number like VO2 Max, actually look at how people breathe during different intensities. So we can pick up very easily respiratory limitations in athletes if you actually look at the data and how big a breath they can take and how fast they can breathe and how they coordinate that at different intensities. And so for practitioners that are looking for limitations from a respiratory side, then I truly believe our device is the only one that can actually do it in a way that's actually functional for most practitioners to actually look at how people are breathing during their sport. The next phase of that, of course, is actually understanding what the limitations are and why they're having those, and then how to train them out of it. Is it a musculoskeletal issue with thoracic mobility? Is it diaphragm strength? Is it diaphragm coordination? Is it coordination of inspiratory versus expiratory muscles? Is there an actual airflow limitation due to size of airways? Or is there a medical reason for that needs to be looked at closer? So is there an asthmatic or a COPD component or some other reactive airways disease or some other component that's actually limiting airflow? And that would need to be looked at on the medical side once it's been picked up out in the field.
And has there been any uptake in the respiratory physician community around
a medical device?
So we get into tricky things. We aren't licensed as a medical device yet. Maybe in the future that's something that we're going to work towards. But certainly we have sent athletes to the medical side of things we have a number of athletes who are identified with exercise-induced asthma. When you actually look at their breathing patterns, they have no asthmatic component. They lose strength and they lose coordination. So they get shorter breath. And it looks like asthma. They start panting, they take short breaths, and then they start constricting their airways. And when you actually send them back to the medical field and say, listen, this person doesn't have a problem with their airways, they have a problem with their coordination of their muscles. Now it becomes a respiratory training solution, not a drug and metabolic challenge. Our device has been used a number of times with athletes to help identify those people that actually do need some sort of medical intervention, but we don't use it to diagnose medical challenges.
That makes sense. Gentlemen, you've both been very generous with your time and sharing the story of what is proprietary technology. So thank you. Andrew, Dr. Sellars, I know you have a hard stop to get to the hospital to do your anaesthetic work. So thank you for stopping by. And Peter, thank you for your contribution as well. And we look forward to seeing the evolution of VO2 Master. What exciting technology. You really are both true endurance innovators.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to meet you in person, or at least as close to person as we can until we get a chance to come down to Australia and see you down there. But thank you very much for the invitation. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. To find out more, people can jump over to VO2 Master, easily found on Instagram as well at VO2 Master. So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I trust and I know you enjoyed today's episode. Now do jump over and check out this great device, the VO2 Master. You'll find it over on Instagram at VO2 Master. That's the numeric 2. And likewise, their website, vo2master.com. A huge thank you to today's show partners, Polar. Check out the Polar Pacer and the Polar Pacer Pro, both beautiful running watches over at polar.com. And of course, our great friends at Endure IQ. Take advantage of the 2 weeks of free coaching by jumping over to the show notes, which can be found at Physical Performance Show via Instagram, or jump over to physicalperformanceshow.com and use the code SQUAD, all capitals, to the numeric. Huge thank you to the team who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, audio engineering, Matthew Walding, show graphic design, Susan Wilkin, show administration, and Milan Borrow, show videography. Speaking of videography, do jump over to our YouTube channel at Physical Performance Show. There you can see video episodes of all the shows, along with shorts of interesting clips. Huge thank you also to our show patrons, including this week's new patrons, Ryan Bordeaux and Raina Pye. Gentlemen, thank you for your practical support of the show. If you'd like to support production of the show, you can do so from just $5 per month, jumping over to physicalperformanceshow.com and clicking on the Patreon tab. Patrons of the show receive complimentary access to our entire back catalogue of live stream events and all upcoming live stream events, including our recently conducted and very popular live stream with Dr. Stephen Seiler, durability and high intensity repeatability in endurance sports. So until next week, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.